What happens when a superpower weaponizes something as fundamental as energy, expecting immediate capitulation, only to discover that coercion has created the exact conditions for its own irrelevance? The answer explains why, right now in the Caribbean, stability has become more valuable than strength, and why predictability is quietly defeating pressure. Tonight, we're witnessing something Washington didn't anticipate, a complete recalibration of how energy moves through the Western Hemisphere, and it happened faster than anyone predicted. On January 11th, 2026, President Trump issued what he believed was a knockout blow. Through his Truth Social account, the message was unambiguous. No more oil, no more money, zero. Make a deal now before it's too late. The target was Cuba. The weapon was energy starvation. The assumption was collapse within weeks. Analysts lined up to forecast economic freefall. Media commentators insisted Havana had nowhere to turn. The entire strategy rested on one belief. Without Venezuelan crude flowing through Caribbean waters, Cuba would have no choice but to fold. They were all utterly incorrect. Here's what actually happened. Between January 3rd and January 11th, the United States executed a military operation in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro. This wasn't diplomatic engagement. This was direct action that left 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel dead, individuals stationed there under security cooperation agreements that had existed for years. The immediate consequence was surgical and devastating. Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba stopped instantly. 26,500 barrels per day disappeared overnight. That represented half of Cuba's total oil deficit, gone in a single policy decision. At the same time, Washington entered negotiations with Caracas over a $2 billion arrangement involving 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude. But this wasn't about stabilizing Venezuela's economy or helping its people. The oil would be rerouted to American refineries while the revenue sat under U.S. Treasury supervision. Control without cooperation, extraction without partnership. Trump's team saw this as the perfect moment to apply maximum pressure. Ultimatums followed. The message was clear: capitulate or watch your economy crumble in real time. But while Washington was issuing demands in capital letters, Cuban officials were already operating on a completely different timeline. Within hours of Trump's post, Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez responded, not with panic, not with defiance designed for theater, but with a statement that revealed Cuba's actual strategy. Cuba has the right to buy fuel from any country willing to sell it. That wasn't bravado. That was a roadmap. Behind the scenes, Havana was already in conversation with Mexico City, not asking for rescue, not begging for temporary relief, asking a fundamentally different question. Who is willing to build long-term energy relationships without attaching political humiliation to every barrel delivered? Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly confirmed that her country had become an important crude supplier to Cuba, not through ideology, not through grand geopolitical alignment or anti-American posturing, through normal commercial exchange, through contracts, deliveries, and mutual benefit. The volumes weren't massive, but the message was unmistakable. Sovereignty doesn't require isolation. Energy security doesn't require choosing sides. And stability matters more than spectacle. That message opened the door for an approach Canada has been refining quietly for decades. Dear viewers, let me show you something about how energy arithmetic actually works in crisis situations. Venezuela supplied Cuba with 26,000 barrels per day. At current market prices, that's worth roughly $47 million per month, $564 million annually. That revenue stream and energy supply is now gone. Mexico has filled part of the gap, but not all of it. Approximately 13,000 barrels per day still need to come from somewhere stable, somewhere reliable, somewhere that won't use fuel as a political weapon. For American oil giants like ExxonMobil or Chevron, 13,000 barrels barely registers as a rounding error. It's a drop in an ocean of production. For Canadian energy firms, that volume represents exactly the kind of medium-scale, long-term partnership that builds trust, creates lasting relationships, and demonstrates that reliable partnerships matter more than massive one-time deals. Canada produces more than 5 million barrels per day and exports the vast majority of it. The infrastructure exists. The refining capacity exists. The logistical experience exists. The shipping routes are established. The legal frameworks are proven. But more than any of that, Canada offers something that has suddenly become the rarest commodity in the hemisphere: predictability. This is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. When Washington conducts military operations, implements oil blockades, and demands political alignment in exchange for fuel, what message does that send to every country in the region? Energy access comes with strings, and those strings can be pulled at any moment based on a single social media post, a political whim, or a strategic recalculation that happens without warning or consultation. When Canada maintains steady exports across changing governments, honors contracts through trade disputes, and separates energy markets from political tantrums, what message does that send? Canadian partnerships endure. They're boring, they're stable, they don't make headlines. And in volatile times, boring is priceless. Even U.S. intelligence assessments acknowledge the limits of Washington's current approach. A leaked analysis made clear that Cuba is under strain. Agriculture and tourism sectors are struggling. Blackouts are frequent across the island. The loss of Venezuelan support makes governance harder and economic management more complex. But notice the language carefully. Could face greater difficulty. Could, not must, not will, not inevitably. That conditional phrasing reveals the reality that analysts understand even if policymakers don't. Havana has options, and it's actively seeking partners who won't turn fuel deliveries into a weapon the moment geopolitical tensions shift or domestic politics change. The narrative that Cuba is isolated and desperate doesn't match what we're actually seeing on the ground. Havana is diversifying its energy partnerships. It's asserting its right to trade freely with willing partners. And it's pushing back against claims that its relationship with Venezuela was based on illicit arrangements rather than legitimate state-to-state cooperation. These are not the actions of a government preparing to surrender. They're the actions of one recalibrating its strategy, diversifying its partnerships, and demonstrating resilience in the face of pressure. And here's the critical point. Every ultimatum from Washington makes Canada's alternative model more attractive, not because Canada lacks interests or operates as a charity, but because it doesn't weaponize unpredictability as a feature of its foreign policy. Here's what the math looks like from Ottawa's perspective. 13,000 barrels per day. That's all Cuba needs to stabilize its energy grid and maintain basic economic functions, to keep the lights on, transportation moving, and essential services operating. Canada can supply that volume without blinking, without straining its production capacity, without political drama, and it can do so without military threats, financial supervision schemes, or public humiliation attached to every shipment. Canada's track record speaks for itself. Energy exports to the United States continued through trade wars, tariff fights, and moments when Washington literally called Canada a national security threat over steel and aluminum. Contracts were honored, deliveries continued, relationships endured even when rhetoric turned hostile. That consistency is now being noticed by every country watching energy supplies become bargaining chips rather than commercial commodities. Cuban officials understand this calculation perfectly. If Mexico can become an important supplier with limited volumes and no political strings, what happens when you work with a major producer that has a decades-long track record of respecting long-term agreements regardless of political weather? The answer is stability. And in the current environment, stability is revolutionary. The pattern is already playing out with remarkable clarity. Pressure from Washington intensifies, adaptation in Havana accelerates, support from Mexico provides breathing room, and quiet, deliberate conversations in Ottawa explore what responsible hemispheric partnerships actually look like when they're based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. Trump believes this strategy showcases American strength and demonstrates decisive leadership. In reality, it highlights American instability and reveals the limits of pressure-based diplomacy. Think about the timeline: one raid, one post, one policy shift, and half of Cuba's energy supply disappears overnight. That's not security, that's exposure, that's not strength, that's volatility weaponized. Canada's approach doesn't carry that risk. No military raids that kill allied personnel, no ultimatums delivered through social media, no conditional supply based on political compliance that can evaporate based on domestic political calculations. Just delivery, contracts, and continuity, month after month, year after year, through changing governments and shifting politics. It may not be dramatic, it doesn't generate headlines or demonstrate machismo, but it works. The ongoing U.S.-Venezuela oil deal sends a clear lesson to every country in the region. Comply or watch your resources rerouted under supervision. Cooperate or face isolation. Accept our terms or lose access to markets. A potential Canada-Cuba energy relationship would teach a different lesson entirely. Reliability outlasts volatility. Stability creates opportunities that pressure destroys. Long-term partnerships built on mutual benefit survive political storms that topple transactional relationships. This moment isn't about saving Cuba from economic collapse. It's about proving there's another way to manage energy relationships in the hemisphere, one grounded in markets rather than muscle, one based on mutual benefit rather than coercion, one that respects sovereignty rather than demanding submission. And here's what makes this shift permanent rather than temporary. Every country in Latin America is watching how this unfolds. They're watching Washington use energy as a weapon. They're watching Mexico step in commercially without political grandstanding. And they're watching Canada demonstrate that long-term partnerships don't require choosing between energy security and sovereignty. They're taking notes, they're drawing conclusions, they're making plans. That's not just a philosophical difference between competing approaches. That's foundational. Trump's gamble may achieve short-term leverage over Cuba. It might generate domestic political wins. It could satisfy supporters who want to see aggressive action. But the long-term message being absorbed across the entire hemisphere is unmistakable. American energy policy comes with conditions that can change overnight based on political calculations you cannot predict or control. Canadian energy policy comes with stability that endures across political cycles, economic shifts, and diplomatic tensions. That distinction is now reshaping how nations throughout Latin America and the Caribbean think about their energy future. The world is watching, not just Cuba, not just governments facing U.S. pressure, but every country that depends on imported fuel and has grown tired of energy being used as a tool of force rather than a basis for partnership. Every nation that values sovereignty, every economy that needs reliable energy, every government that refuses to choose between keeping the lights on and maintaining dignity. They're all watching this moment, and they're all drawing the same conclusion. Strength is not volatility, power is not unpredictability, and leverage built on coercion is inherently temporary because it creates the exact incentives for targets to seek alternatives. And as this crisis continues to unfold day by day, the most valuable asset in the Western Hemisphere is no longer oil itself, it's trust. And Canada just demonstrated it has what Washington is rapidly losing, not through grand pronouncements, not through military demonstrations, not through ultimatums or threats, through quiet competence, through decades of reliability, through honoring commitments even when relationships become difficult. That's the leverage that lasts. That's the power that endures, and that's why 13,000 barrels per day represents far more than an energy transaction. It represents the future of how partnerships work in a hemisphere that's tired of coercion masquerading as cooperation.